Hey, what's going on, good people? It's Gardner Douglas, your oyster ninja. Today we are blessed with one of the legends in the game, Mr. Jason Woodside, all the way from PEI.
Prince Edward Island, Canada.
Oh, boom. And so Jason is a two-time Canadian oyster shucking champ, and also the creator of the Banjo Oyster knife. That's one of my favorites, and if you're familiar with the Oyster Ninja, you've seen me shucking with that banjo knife. This is the guy behind it. What's going on, Jason?
Not too much at all, Gardner. Just enjoying a great day. I was out swimming the Lease earlier. I was right there in the water with the oysters. My skin feels fabulous. I think oyster probably good for the skin for sure, and it's just a beautiful, perfect, picturesque day here in Prince Edward Island.
Look at that, man. We don't get that every day.
I wanted to do something special for you for having me on the podcast today, and so I thought I'd come down to the wharf and show you the Oyster King. The Oyster King is our boat that we use for hauling the oysters in and out, and it's parked just over here.
Sheesh, how big is it?
Oh, probably 35 feet-ish. Okay. It's actually an old lobster boat that's been repurposed for doing the oysters for us. And then what we do is we have this giant hydraulic boom on there, and we just use that for bringing in the cages. So we have the oysters are all in cages, and we go out and we haul them out, or we put them out, and that's it. That little boat does a lot of work.
So before we actually jump into what we call Jason Woodside, can we talk a little bit about just the history of Prince Edward Island? And you talked a little bit about the lobster boats, but now it's an oyster boat. So can you talk a little bit about that, man?
Well, yeah, sure. So, the interesting thing about the PEI oyster industry is that for years and years and years, it was dependent on what's called the wild fishery, where, as you know, people would go out and tong wild oysters and bring them back and then depurate them somewhere and that sort of thing. And then with the advent of culturing oysters, we've had to sort of innovate a little. So a lot of other equipment gets repurposed for oyster culture. So the lobster boat was one of them. And then of course there's mussel equipment and other stuff, sizers and things like that we're always kind of picking at and trying to figure out the best ways to grow oysters. So there's a couple of different systems, but it's all the floating cages now. So all the oysters are out there in the floating cages. There is still a wild fishery here, of course, but the cultured oysters are definitely taking over as far as that is. And the large wild oysters are also getting harder and harder to find too.
Right, no doubt. So how did you get into this industry, man? Just seafood and oysters and oyster shucking.
It's a really funny story, actually. I was 18 years old, and I was washing dishes in my cousin's restaurant in Toronto. And, of course, I'm from PEI. And so he said, well, you must know how to shuck oysters, right? And I was like, yeah, of course I do. But I really didn't know how to shuck oysters to save my life. So I was like, but I'm from PEI. Of course I know how to shuck oysters. So I started shucking, and when I got good at it, so I was just shucking in the restaurant. And then when I got good at it, they were like, why don't you go out front and shuck oysters? So I would do that. That restaurant, my cousin Adam, he eventually opened up Oyster Boy in Toronto. So that's where I worked for a long time. So I got in on the ground level. What I did was I was shucking in the kitchen, and then I started shucking for service. And then Adam started taking me out on oyster catering events. My first event was at Wayne Gretzky Sports Bar in Toronto that I ever did. Wow. And I went there and I was shucking oysters. And what I couldn't get over was the fact that people were freaking out. They were like, oh my God, there's oysters. These oysters are great. You're the best. You're the best oyster shucker ever. It's like my first gig ever. I was like fumbling most of them probably. So I thought, wow, there's really something to this. And as Oyster Boy became a restaurant and grew from there, I got in the ground level. And so I got a whole education right away when I was 18, 19 years old. I got involved in the oyster business, and I really just went from there. And, I started looking at it as a kind of sommelier sort of thing, where there was so much to know about the oysters and about where they come from and how there's all different types of oysters. And so I just got really, really interested in it. And I also, at the time, thought that one of the coolest jobs ever was being a beer rep. And I ended up becoming the oyster rep for Oyster Boy, in the sense that they put me in the wholesale position. I was delivering oysters to restaurants in Toronto and shucking oyster catering events in Toronto, and that's just kind of how it happened. I just got really into it, and I got better at shucking, and I really embraced the lifestyle of it, sort of, going out and doing events. It's kind of like this sort of rock star thing in a way, where you go to an event, everyone's just so happy to see you. You're the last guy into the party and you're the first one out. It's perfect. And it just went from there after that.
Nice, man. That's the same thing that got me hooked, man. Just the high of being the life of the party.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, of course, that because I was from PEI, when I would come back to PEI in the summer for my vacations, I would go and visit some of the oyster growers that we were buying and distributing oysters for. So then that's where my education really started. Very good dear friend of ours here in Canada, John Bill, was one of the first guys to teach me about oysters. And he was one of the first guys to really explain to me how the growing and processing works. And I had great people like that to teach me and to learn from, all these sort of legends in the oyster business, George Carr and Johnny Flynn. I was really fortunate that I got to go and tour these farms and see the oysters growing. And then I would go back to Toronto and I'd tell all my clients and customers about this. And it really just went from there. And so now I've transitioned where I'm not so much of a high volume oyster shucker anymore. I work the farm and I do this part of it now. And it's, it's been quite enriching for my life, to say the least.
Man, you can't get out, man. You're stuck.
I really am. And you know what? I tried to take a break from the oyster business for a while, and I went to college and I went to renewable energy school, because the oyster farmers were the first ones to start telling me about renewables and whatnot. So I went and I took solar, and I thought, well, maybe I won't do oysters anymore. I'll do something else. But you know what? After like half a year of doing that, I just came back. I came right back to the oyster business.
Right. And you mentioned a huge name that I kind of just stumbled upon, which was John Bill. And that's only because of when he passed and went on to Oyster Heaven. But can you just talk a little bit about him, man? Because a lot of people don't know like I did. Is there anything you can say?
I can. Well, John Bill is certainly how do I put it? He's really the true figurehead, I would say, of the ship to shore concept of knowing where your food comes, and the responsibility, so to speak, of the harvester or of the fisher person, to maintain these beautiful waterways, but at the same time reap the bounty of the ocean, so to speak. So John was really, really into that. He would go out with George Carr, and they would fish anything. They would fish oysters. They'd tong oysters all day. John was really the first oyster shucker in Canada to do that, to like go out and really get involved in the farms, and then to even just leave the business of oyster catering and everything, and to just strictly work on the farm. And he did that for a long time. And then after he learned pretty much everything you can learn by working on the oyster farm and by working in different sort of fishing industries here on PEI, then he went out again, and then he took all of that knowledge to the world, and then he told everybody about it through his book and through different events he's done and through restaurants he's helped open and stuff like that. He's also the only he's a left-handed oyster shucker, which is awesome, like me. And so I was fortunate enough that he gave me one of my first lessons in shucking oysters. And he was a good friend. He was a good guy, and we certainly all miss him. There was a big hole left when he passed, and I think even now we're still trying to fill that hole.
Right. Appreciate you for saying those kind words, man, and introducing our listeners to Mr. John Bill if they haven't already heard of him. So, so you started at the Raw Bar. How did you get into competition shucking?
Oh, well, I got to tell you. So I went to my first contest ever at Rodney's Oyster House in the summer of 1999.
Ooh,
Okay.
vintage, vintage.
Oh, yeah. And what was really interesting about it was to see all the shuckers. They all had like shirts, with like custom printed shirts, and they all had their oyster knives. And at first I was like, oh, okay, oyster shucking competition, this will be fun. And I went there and I realized it was a lot like a skate competition, like skateboarding, you know?
Okay.
I'm looking at all these different guys. They work for different oyster houses. They work for different places. They're all sporting their shirt, jersey, or whose hat they're wearing or whatever. And I'm like, wow, must be what it would have been like to be at like the Del Mar skate contest, and to see skateboarders like competing against each other. And I was like, this is just really cool. I love how everyone's in competition, but it's friendly, but it's competitive, it's serious. And I fell in love with it. When I got on stage and they said 3, 2, 1, shuck, and I shucked that first 18 oysters, that was it. I was hooked.
So how is the competition? Well, I don't know if it's changed over the years, but how was it when you were competing? So it was 18 oysters?
That's right. So the Canadian Championships is 18 oysters, and other contests around are usually 12 oysters. And 12 oysters I kind of call a sprint.
Oh, yeah.
18 oysters is a little better, where it's kind of like mid-range. Very rarely is there ever a contest here that has 24 oysters. And then, of course, as you know, in Ireland, where they do the 30 oysters, that's just a marathon.
Right, yeah.
So typically we shuck 18 oysters here. I was champion in 2004 and in 2006. In 2004, my flat time was 1 minute and 47 seconds. In 2006, for 18 oysters, my flat time was 1 minute and 23 seconds.
Come on, guy.
Well,
what happened?
I'll tell you a secret. Okay, so we table shuck here in Canada primarily. We don't do a lot of hand shucking. Like the guys on the wharf for the oyster fisher people actually do a lot of hand shucking. But when we serve oysters here, typically it's table shucking. So what I did was I lined up my 18 oysters on the tray on the table. I popped off all the lids, and then I flipped the tray around. I spun the tray around, and then I severed all the bottoms. So I eliminated like a second and a half off of each oyster right away. And some people were cranky at that, but it wasn't in the rules that you can't do that. So that was fine. And I did that. And then the next year, I was so flattered. I walked into the contest, and Rodney Clark looked at me and he said, Mr. Woodside, I'd like to point out a few rule changes here this year. And the rule was you can't start your time with your oysters on the presentation tray.
Wow. Okay. All right.
So that's the story behind that. And I have another trick up my sleeve that I might pull out one of these years when I feel like dazzling the crowd again, but I can't tell you yet.
Got you. No problem. I understand, man. I totally understand. So when's the last time you competed?
Well, that would have been 3 Septembers ago at the International Shellfish Festival.
Okay.
That was the last time I competed. I came in second place. So I was second in PEI behind this really awesome oyster shucker. His name is Bradley Gallant. And that's it. And then I actually made the switch to judging. So I've been judging the Canadian Championships for the last couple of summers. And I also judged at the International Shellfish Festival here in Charlottetown the last 2 or 3 years as well. And I must say that I really like the judging, and often the shuckers tell me they're really happy to know that I'm judging because I know what to look for.
Man, that's huge right there, man. I'm not going to say I can't stand. I don't want to be that guy. But, man, when you get, like, people and they kind of halfway judge, and it's no consistency. So I might have a good judge, but then it's another guy beside it that doesn't really know what he's looking at or looking for.
Right, exactly. And you know what? And that happens. In my experience in oyster shucking competitions, the people judging the plates of oysters might know oysters, but they don't necessarily shuck oysters. And it makes a big difference when you're judging the plate to know what the person was doing when they were shucking that plate. Like I can see when somebody covered up a mistake. If someone tears the stomach, let's say, going in, but they cover it up on the way out.
Yep.
I would almost award bonus points for that.
No doubt.
It's like if you
Oh
can,
man.
if you wreck that oyster and then you can make it look presentable so that somebody in a restaurant who's paying $3 for that oyster doesn't know the difference, that's the mark of a good oyster shucker.
There you go. So let's jump into the banjo, man. How'd you come up on the banjo?
Well, the funny thing about the banjo was for years, and like since the very moment I started shucking oysters, I realized that the bulbous round handles don't work for me. They're
Okay.
hard to squeeze, right? Your hand isn't straight, like, your forearm and then your hand is like this, and you're doing this and you're using all these muscles in your forearm. And I thought there's just got to be a better way, because at the time I was teaching the oyster shucking class at Oyster Boy on weekends, where people would come and we would give them a little 2-hour sort of class where they got to eat some oysters and shuck some oysters, and it was hugely successful. I taught about 2,000 people how to shuck oysters from that.
Wow.
And what I realized was that everyone was struggling trying to hold the knife. And I said, there's gotta be a better way. Gotta be a better way to do this. So I came up with a few initial designs and messed around. And then I realized, well, where I got the idea was a skateboard wheel. So the
There it
skateboard
is.
wheel, right, you hold in your hand. Now I can push and I can turn and I don't have to squeeze on the handle. So once I came up with that, it was a matter of trial and error. The first ones that I made, I ended up pouring epoxy. Like, I was using this 2-part resin sort of stuff, and I had to make silicon molds, and it was a lot of fun and it was really interesting, but it was incredibly messy and time consuming. And then I figured out how to cut them out of wood. So it's been quite a change from the first banjos until the ones you see now. But really, the banjo was born out of the necessity to have a tool that people could use who aren't used to using tools.
There you go.
And as you know, shucking oysters is one of the most precarious and difficult sort of things to do if you're not used to it. Like, some people can't even use a screwdriver. So to teach someone to shuck oysters, you have to have something that's easy for them to use. And those bulbous handles, in my opinion, are just a little antiquated, I think. They're good for the people that have used one of those to shuck a million oysters, like you and I,
Right.
but for somebody who just wants to shuck a few dozen oysters at home every now and then, I think that something that's easier to use is just super important.
There you go, man. You found a hole and put yourself in it. So that's all that matters, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And I love it. It works,
It does. And, the most important thing, too, is that it also helps people to access that sustainable protein that they might not have access to, or that, maybe people can't afford to go out to an oyster bar all the time. But if you go to the seafood store and you buy yourself a dozen oysters every other week and bring them home and shuck them, then I think that would be one of the first steps to leading a very healthy lifestyle.
Honestly, man, that's the time we're in right now anyway, because you can't really get out to the raw bars like you used to. Now things are starting to open up a little bit more, but that's the time we're in where people are learning how to shuck oysters. I know the views on my how to shuck oysters videos have jumped. Everybody's learning how to do it themselves.
Yes, exactly. Also, I just finished putting together a little booklet, the Banjo book, and what it's going to do is it's going to give people the basic instructional information they need to go and buy oysters, bring those oysters home, store those oysters in their fridge, shuck those oysters and eat them, and even how to cook those oysters. And it's just very simple, basic information. Keep them in the fridge, keep them covered, give them a quick rinse. Scrubbing them with a wire brush is not necessary in this day and age. Oh, there you are.
Yep.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Where can when is the book going to be available?
The book will be available in about 2 weeks.
Okay.
It's just a nice, simple little training manual. It's about the size of a book that would fit in a CD case.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, a small little thing. It's really fun. It's, I did all the illustrations myself, and it was a great learning curve putting that little book together, I must say. But that's what you need. You need a few basic facts, a good knife, some fresh oysters, and get at it.
There you go. Boom, man. So we I think before we started recording, I'm not sure if you jumped into it, but just talk a little bit about what you're doing now and working with the oysters.
Okay, so now that I've been back on PEI now for 4 years, and this was a great opportunity to come back here. I was really tired of the city life. I was living in Toronto, and oh my gosh, it's so busy. There's no such thing as rush hour anymore. It's just rush hour all the time now. So I came back to PEI. It's nice and quiet here. There's lots of space, lots of fresh air. I wanted to get my Banjo Oyster knife business up and on the go. And the beauty of that too is that all banjos are made from PEI hardwood. So you have a little piece of PEI with you if you have a Banjo Oyster knife. So I wanted to set that up, and then I wanted to change my life and just, I didn't want to work anymore. I wanted to enjoy my life. So being that I know so much about oysters and love the oyster business, it just made sense for me to work in oyster production here on PEI. So my friend at Atlantic Shellfish, Jacob Dockendorf, who's the president of Atlantic Shellfish, he offered me a position with them, which I took, and I've been having a great time here ever since. It's, what can I say? It's beautiful. Every day I get to work. It's like I work at the beach every day. And I don't know, so between that and the oyster knife business, that's kind of what keeps me involved. The farming part of it is great. I do still get to go out and shuck some oysters. My friend who owns a restaurant in a place called Darnley Basin, it's called Ship to Shore. John Bill used to work there back in the day, actually, at that same restaurant. She asked me if I would be willing to do a little oyster night there on Saturday nights for the summer, which I've agreed to because I still like shucking plates of oysters for people. So I get the best of both worlds now, where I get to grow the oysters. I get to do all the jobs that involve growing the oysters. I still get to shuck the oysters and serve them to people and talk about them. And I get to make the knife that people get to use to open oysters.
Oh, so you was naming off some of the oysters that you guys are farming.
That's right. Yeah. So we have Savage Blondes. That's like our sort of, I would call, the benchmark brand. Savage Blondes come from Savage Harbor, which is, well, if you're looking over there into the sunlight, I know it's real bright. It's past that point. So it's just around that point over there. And
those are real popular around here too.
They're called blondes, because the shell has that lovely goldish blondie color. And then there's the tuxedos. The tuxedos are like a really nice choice-shaped oyster with nice cup. And they tend to have the darker shells. The darker shells with sort of like white highlights. Then there's the redhead selects, which are my fave because those are some bottom wild oysters. So we have those on our bottom lease. What we do is not all the oysters that we grow in cages. So in the culture of oysters, as you may know, there's also bottom leases where you can spread oyster seed out on the bottom and then go out and harvest it later. And so we do a lot of that too. And the redhead selects are these really nice, deep cup, thick oysters that are just fabulous. And then there's the shipwreck selects, which are very nice. And those ones come from South Lake, where I was swimming the lease today. And they have a really nice meat, like the meats in them are so full and plump. When you open up the oyster, it's almost like bursting out of the shell. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's my favorite. When they're popping out the shell, man, it's crazy.
I know, me too. It's the best. And let's see. After that, we've got the South Lake Selects, which come from the same place in South Lake. And then we, sort of have like a more generic brand, which we don't call Malpex. I know, maybe you recognize the name Malpec being a PEI oyster. And, to give a little history on that, the oyster industry in PEI was kind of killed in the early part of the 1900s because of diseases like MSX and things like that. So they used Malpeque oysters to reseed the rest of PEI, like oysters from Malpeque Bay, that is. And then in the 70s, the PEI government thought that they would just brand every oyster from PEI as a Malpeque because it was a super world famous kind of name. And then after that, people started growing oysters and they didn't want to be just Malpeques like everybody else, right? They wanted to be different and they wanted to differentiate themselves. So that's why we have a lot of branded marketing names now, whether it's, you know, Savage Blonde or Raspberry Point or whatever, you know, those are all cultured PEI oysters. And so you can't really call them a Malpeque at this point. Malpeque, I would say, is a regional term just for PEI oysters.
That's cool. I didn't know that, man, about the Malpeques, but that's good to know. And I'm not gonna hold you long, man. You gave a lot of nuggets here tonight, and I see it's kind of hot out there on you.
It's warm. It's a scorcher here.
No doubt, man. But I appreciate you for taking time out, man. I love the banjo knife. I'm probably gonna be getting some more soon, and maybe we can do a giveaway or something when I drop this video.
That sounds great, Gardner. I'd be happy to do that. We should definitely do something. I would love to be a part of it.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Again, thank you for your time, man, and keep on doing what you're doing for the industry. I love it, man.
Thank you so much, Gardner. It's been a pleasure, and I really look forward to the day that we can finally hang out together. Whenever there's a festival again, we're going to be there.
No doubt. Sounds good, man.
All righty. Take care.
All right.
Thank you.